Welcome everybody to 19V. I'm Ann Lounsbury from NYU, and we want to start, as always, by thanking the Jordan Center at NYU for supporting our meetings, and especially Sasha Spitalnik and her assistants, including today Dina Sheets, who work with us to organize all of our technical support. This is our last talk in 2023. So before we get started, I'll give you a brief preview of what's ahead in 2024. We'll start up again on January 24th. Ingrid Giespees from the University of Florida will speak on, quote, a revolutionary early retirement, question mark, Shadayev and the affect of contempt in 1820, 1821. And I don't have a subsidiary for that one yet, but there may already be one and I just don't know. Then we'll also be hosting talks by Nina Steiner, who'll speak on Tolstoy, February 28th, Nadia Peterson on Chekhov, March 27th, Mikhail Velizhev on Shadayev, again, Shadayev's definitely having a moment, on April 24th, and John Webley, who's an art historian, will speak to us on May 22nd. So we'll, if you're on the mailing list for 19V, you want to make sure that you write to the Jordan Center, and all those dates, you'll get reminders. So let me welcome today's speaker and собеседник. Our speaker is Greg Afinogenov from Georgetown, and his title is, quote, Too Much to Ban, Policing the Graphosphere in Paul I's Riga. Our собеседник is Linda Mayhew from University of Texas at Austin. So thanks very much. And Greg will talk for, I don't know, half an hour or so, or a little more. And then Linda will give brief remarks and then we'll open it up. Greg, welcome.
Thank you so much. You know, it's wonderful to see you here. Many of you I've seen recently in person. So it's good to see you again, even if on Zoom. So let me just get right to it because there's plenty of material. I will share my screen. So I'm going to introduce this concept of the graphosphere soon, but I want to, I want to note, I didn't note this anywhere in the abstract or anything, but of course, Too Much to Ban is an allusion to Anne Blair's book, Too Much to Know, which is about kind of dealing with the surplus of information in early modern Europe. And I think we'll see some of that in this talk. So the first thing I want to highlight is there's going to be a lot of these passages of text. I'm not going to read them all. I'm just going to focus on the words in red, but I'll let you kind of read them as you go. So in April 1800, Paul banned the import of foreign books. And this is the full text of this decree. So it's basically a single sentence, which is not the case for many of Paul's decrees. This book cites the corruption of faith, civil law, and good order from the importation of books, and bans not only all books from abroad, but also sheet music, which is a thing that I will return to a bit later. So there's a few things I want to note about this decree, which is that, first of all, of course, this is generally portrayed as an indication of Russia's increasing repressiveness in relation to the fear of the French Revolution and paranoia about the influence of various Jacobin propaganda and so on and so forth. And of course, to a certain extent, this is true. But I also want to note that this is an admission of weakness because the Russian imperial state had relied for the entirety of the 18th century on the importation of books. And it had very much, incorporated the importation and translation of foreign books into its cultural policy, even with a considerable degree of censorship the entire time. So clearly something has changed by the end of the 18th century such that this is no longer feasible. And as we'll see, I think there's actually a very specific reason that this decree came along when it did. I don't have a smoking gun, but I think by the end of this, you'll probably agree with me that there is a very concrete cause. In general, there is a problem when it comes to censorship in the 18th century, especially in this late post-revolutionary period, which is that Russia's state capacity is not really at the same level as its appetite for the suppression of bad publications of various kinds. So this is a frequently cited letter, but it's a letter from the military commander of Moscow, Alexander Prozorovsky, to Catherine II in 1793, where he says that, it's the police basically can't handle censorship, that the former Politzmeister doesn't know any foreign languages, and in any case, the police don't have time to read all the books that it needs to read. And this is Moscow. And this is also in the age of Catherine, right? Well before the far more ambitious censorship reforms of Paul, which come along in 1797, 98. So we already know that there's a problem, and that censorship doesn't really, that even though the repressive capacities of the Russian state are very great, though in the case of censorship, those run up against the very serious problem of not having enough educated elites to be able to carry out those repressive functions. And this is something that is going to pose a very permanent problem into the following decades. So now I want to turn to the key concept that's underlying my talk here, which is the graphosphere. And this is a concept that comes from Simon Franklin. I've quoted a passage here, the opening passage, in fact, from his article, Mapping the Graphosphere. But he also has a book on the topic called The Russian Graphosphere, which is much more comprehensive. And so for Franklin, the graphosphere is the totality of graphic devices used to record, store, display, and disseminate messages and information. And so even though, in theory, this could be identified with the world of books, in fact, what he points out is that, the graphosphere is actually much larger. It doesn't just include books. It also includes things like letters and street signs and decrees and blank forms and things like that, right? And what he says when he says the graphosphere has two types of boundary, external and internal, what he means by that is the external boundary of the graphosphere is the relationship between the graphosphere, right, the totality of all these symbolic representations, with the entire world around it, which is sort of non-textual or not even like visually textual. And so, we can see in 17th century Russia a gradual transition to a graphosphere that is expanding and colonizing more and more parts of especially the world of the capital, but is still very incompletely penetrating to most parts of the empire, although it's already starting in more ways than people generally appreciate. But by the 18th century, the graphosphere has expanded very significantly. And so, so that the typical urban dweller in 18th century Russia, even if that person may not be fully literate, is a person who navigates a world of written representations in a variety of different ways. And moreover, kind of non-written representations have to engage or interact with written representations in other ways. So, a classic example of the graphosphere is in medieval England, right? The reason we have like pubs today called like the Fox and Hounds or the Rabbit and the Clock or something is that because 18th century or early modern and medieval pub signs in England consisted of images because people were not literate. And so it was the image of, a fox and hounds, which was then textually transmuted later on into the sign of the Fox and Hounds, so that the typical illiterate or non-literate town dweller could recognize a visual representation. Anyway, this is all kind of prelude. And the internal boundary of the graphosphere is the relationship between different kinds of texts, whether manuscript and printed, books and letters, other types of texts within the field of the graphosphere. This is a theoretical concept, but as we'll see, it will become very relevant for understanding the problem of censorship in Paul's time. So I want to go through some representations or examples, aspects of the graphosphere that came under official suspicion and in some cases outright repression in the 1790s. And I want to note that these are not consistent policies. The same type of text might be banned in one context and not banned in another. But it's important for us to see the breadth of what is being embraced by censorship in this era. So, of course, the most famous example is Radishev's book, Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow. This is a very straightforward example. This is a book. It contains politically subversive material. It is under suspicion. It is banned. Okay. So there is a play by Knyazhnin called Vadim of Novgorod, which is also banned at the same time. This play is ostensibly about the Middle Ages in Russia, and it contains some basically proto-liberal ideas, although, it was written in 1789, and so it fell under a cloud of suspicion only after the revolution took place and news about it filtered through to St. Petersburg. So Catherine decided that she didn't like it only in the context of the very new political ideological environment generated by the French Revolution. So Vadim of Novgorod as a play and as a text was also banned. Okay. Then we have another example, which is kind of moving further down the chain of relevance to direct political questions. Karamzin's selection of translations of speeches by Demosthenes. Of course, Demosthenes is an Athenian orator who lived thousands of years before the French Revolution, and so could not have had directly subversive effects. But because some of the content of those speeches was deemed politically inconvenient at that particular time, even though, of course, Catherine had invested lots of money in projects like the Society for the Translation of Foreign Books, nevertheless, in this particular case, a classical translation was deemed politically dubious. Okay. Prints, visual prints in this case, not really written documents, depicting the execution of Louis XVI. Now, these prints, from what I've been able to tell, they were not like positively representing the execution. They were basically just like informational items. But for obvious reasons, this was something that was that under a cloud of suspicion in the capital, because Catherine not only wanted to prevent positive information about the French Revolution from reaching the literate population of the capital, but also wanted to prevent non-literate audiences from finding out about what exactly had happened in France, lest they get too many ideas. Or at least that's the typical story. I don't want to get too much into challenging it here, but we can see the logic of this. Then, slightly less obvious, a shipment of playing cards at the city of, I believe at the port of Dorpat, or one of the other Estonian ports or Estonian ports, received a shipment of playing cards featuring characters such as Hamlet and Henry V from various Shakespearean plays. This shipment was deemed politically subversive and destroyed because the argument was that the depiction of these characters was prejudicial to monarchy, since these characters obviously in Shakespeare's plays are not straightforwardly positive. And so this was another example of a banned representation. And then I think the ultimate example of how the Graphosphere needed to confront the challenge of the French Revolution is the destruction of an entire shipment of blank paper in Arkhangelsk, because it had a watermark that supposedly depicted some sort of French revolutionary symbol, perhaps a tree of liberty or something similar. So this is a text, literally a non-textual representation that is, in theory, not a representation at all. It's just a watermark on a piece of paper, and nevertheless, this was subject to suspicion. So censorship was very ambitious in the 1790s, but could it deliver on that ambition? And so in the rest of the talk, we'll try to figure out whether, in fact, it could. So my talk today will focus on the city of Riga. We all pretty much know what Riga is, and of course, there are a number of other ports in the Russian Empire, but for my purposes, it's very important to know that Riga is basically the westernmost significant port in the Russian Empire. And, you know, there are other Memel and Libau have certain port facilities, but the vast majority of Baltic trade, I think, goes through Riga, basically. That doesn't go through St. Petersburg. And as the westernmost post port in Russia, we'll talk about some of the implications of that, or in the Russian Empire, of course. But I also want to say that I was able to use many of the archival materials I use in this talk, thanks to the Latvian State Historical Archives, the LVVA, which have much more generous, for example, photographing policies than you would typically encounter in a Russian collection. So in many ways, I was very fortunate to be able to use those documents. We are in Riga. Let's move on. And of course, this talk primarily concerns 1798 and 99, which are kind of like some of the core early years of Paul's rule. There's a thing that I want you to notice here, which is that Riga is north of the city of Mitau, which is the capital of Courland. And Courland, it is also the main port for Courland in general, although it is not technically part of Courland. Courland was annexed in 1795, and we'll talk about some of the circumstances of that annexation in a second. So I want to list some tasks of the Riga censors. So this is a page from a list of Hebrew texts that they were charged with examining as one of their many functions. So their geographical description was the Livland, Estland, Courland, Lithuania, Gubernia, right? Which basically includes all of this. So basically the entire western borderlands of the empire. What kinds of materials did the censorship charged with? Not only mail, periodicals, books, and broadsides. That's my translation of объявление, which I think could mean basically anything that wasn't a book or a newspaper. books, plays, and compositions printed in print shops, in other words, locally produced publications, including Hebrew print shops in the Pale of Settlement, which were specifically designed for Hebrew religious texts. Plays put on in the Riga theater, which meant that, not only printed copies of plays imported from abroad, but also the kinds of manuscripts used by actors in the preparation of their lines, for example, as well as imported manuscripts, letters, and so forth. So this is quite a large swath of material, and it is basically it attempts to embrace more or less the entire graphosphere. Street signs and whatnot would probably not be included, but as far as text containing a potentially subversive political message are concerned, this would basically be the entirety of them. And here's the list of languages that the censors had to work in. So you can see this is a lot of different languages. So for Hebrew, they had a special expedition of 3 Jews. An expedition in 18th century Russian parlance is a special department. But that doesn't mean that every censor had to be literate in all of these languages, but it does mean that collectively the censors had to be responsible for this. Now, the important thing is that the Riga censorship department, which was arguably the largest in the empire, or certainly the one with the greatest workload, was consisted of 3 censors. There were also a clerical staff, but I think it's not really clear to me what role the clerical staff actually played. But they essentially, the 3 censors together were responsible for all of these languages, at least on some level, whether they were literally physically reading the books or not. I think in most cases they had to. So that is a lot of work for 3 people. And as we'll see, it's even more work than it looks like. There are some particular difficulties posed by the Riga context. One is its location, right? So Riga is located as the westernmost major port. It is also at the hub of a lot of smuggling and trade networks that reach all the way into Germany, the Baltic, and Western Europe. And unlike St. Petersburg, which is relatively isolated from those currents, or at least could be more easily controlled, especially because of its much larger military presence. So, and also, of course, the other gubernia included in that include gubernia that are relatively recently annexed and not well controlled. And we'll talk about that in a bit. So Riga was the delivery point for a lot of trade, and especially a lot of the book trade. And this meant that this was very, that potentially the censors could not predict how much text they were going to have to process. And interacting with that is that the scope of the local graphosphere in the Baltic provinces is much, much greater than it was elsewhere in the empire, because almost every single person. So, it's really hard to estimate how many people were actually literate, because there's no comprehensive studies of literacy in the late 18th century, at least in this region. But in the late 19th century census, the Baltic provinces had nearly complete literacy by about 1900, whereas, far ahead of the rest of the Russian provinces. And I think that probably the same relationship held true back then, which meant that far more readers of various social classes were available and consuming books actively in Riga than elsewhere, including in St. Petersburg. And that meant that also the scope of the graphosphere, in other words, all of the kinds of daily life texts that one generates as a literate person, receipts and letters and notes and plays and whatnot, all of these things are subject to censorial control. And then a final detail are the specific politics of Courland. Courland, as I said, is annexed in 1795. It is not annexed as part of the partitions of Poland, notably. It is annexed by request of a deputation of the local nobility, which goes to St. Petersburg and basically demands that Catherine annex them. And what they're trying to do is essentially checkmate their local duke, who they accuse of being overly centralizing. And essentially, it's a sort of mini French Revolution, as they understand it. So many kind of the early stages of the French Revolution, right, when it's still elite versus king. But also Courland has lots of other manifestations of revolutionary culture. There are peasant revolts, there are merchant revolts, there are, disseminations of news about France in the local press. And so in other words, and Courland was completely uncontrolled by Russia, or at least not directly controlled by Russia until 1795. So there's an entire revolutionary context there, which is not to say that people there are aching to revolt, but it does mean that they're far less controllable than the much more sort of like the people of St. Petersburg, who are far more securely established in the repressive information ecology of 18th century Russia. So we go now to our main protagonist, who is the civil censor of Riga, Fëdor Tumanskii. So Tumanskii is born outside of Gluchov, which is the capital of the Hetmanate, of the Russian-controlled Hetmanate. and he's born in the closing years of that institution's existence. And he, as far as I can tell, I mean, he is referred to as a Malaros, in different sources about him. He clearly feels a sense of otherness in relation to St. Petersburg culture, or at least like people describe him as having an accent and stuff like that. So I don't know. His Ukrainian identity does play into this, although I'm not exactly sure how. But more importantly, he's a very enthusiastic participant in the Catherinian pursuit of basically popular or forms of enlightenment targeted at the dissemination of a kind of literary public sphere among the elite. So he's one of the main editors of Lekarstvatskii Zabot, which is an important 1780s publication. There's several others that he also participates in. He is a corresponding member of the Academy. In other words, he's a senior Russian intellectual of a very particular Catherinian Enlightenment Voltairean type of vein. He is described in the sources that we have about the Riga censorship as being unusually repressive. So our most prominent source on this is August von Kotzebue, who is a kind of a German-speaking playwright who leaves memoirs about his role. And he basically describes Tumanskii as the epitome of this like petty, extremely malicious Catherinian censor or Pauline censor who, there's supposedly a line in one of Kotzebue's plays where he refers to Russia being very cold, and Tumanskii allegedly forces him to edit that line so it doesn't say that Russia is so cold. So it's that kind of, he's depicted as being unusually stern and rigid. And we'll see whether that's true in a second. But I think it's important to know that we don't really have a lot of autobiographical material by him, at least in this era, that I have found. I may be wrong, but we'll see. Maybe somebody can suggest something later. Anyway, so Tumanskii becomes the protagonist of the Riga censorship because, as we'll see, he gets embroiled in a local controversy that becomes kind of significant. And now I want to turn, I apologize for the small text on this slide, but it's kind of important. I wanted to get it all on one page. I want to give an overview of the activities of the censors. So the Riga archive contains basically 2 years of month-by-month vedomosti about the monthly activities of these censors. And these are broken down into types of activities. So this is from November 1798. So the first items here are kipe, which are basically bundles of books. So they have 42 unopened kipe at the beginning of November. I'm not going to go through all these numbers, but to just give you a sense. They have opened 14 over the course of the month, and then, new arrivals 14. They've opened 14 over the course of the month, so then they have 42 bundles remaining. Section 2 is books. So they have 2,957 books left over at the beginning of the month, and 2,821 books have arrived. And then over the course of the month, they process 2,557. They 3 await a decision. 35 of them are banned. So actually, not a very significant number are banned, although that number does go up slightly over the course of the 2 years. These are also 330 books are banned by a separate decision process. It's too complicated to get into here. So then there's 406 letters that are also contained in these parcels that also need to be examined. Then there are books sent by mail, which presumably are manuscripts. Then 87 periodicals. Or 122, 87 periodicals in Riga, 122 periodicals in Courland. Plays, a list of plays that were put on at the Riga theater, and books from Riga print shops, books from Mitau print shops. Mitau is the capital of Courland, which is now known as Jelgava. Books in Finnish from Dorpat. Foreign so various foreign publications. So 488 Jewish books from the Hebrew Hebrew Exposition, and poems and music from abroad 650, and so on, right? So this is an extremely extensive set of activities. And I'm going to focus here on just the books because I think that's the most obvious thing to talk about. But of course, we could spend time talking about any of these sections. But music is another part of this, which gets mentioned in other vedomosti. The vedomosti don't have a consistent format. It's signed here by one of the by the sort of like the secretary basically of the censors. Usually all three censors have to sign off though. So the heart of the problem of the Riga censorship, and this is sort of like the key slide for me in this talk, is the problem of the books in arrears. And so it starts off in 1798 with already almost 3,000 books in arrears, in other words, left over unexamined from the previous month. It starts to fall off a little bit, but then it starts to rise again, and there's almost 4,000 by April 1799. And then as we go through into 1799, the number just skyrockets over the course of that year. And what that means is that the censors are basically unable to process all the books that they're getting. There is just too much to ban, as the talk indicates, right? There are a few details here that are kind of important. One is that the number of books in arrears does not appreciably go down over the course of the winter months. And that's really important because I think the hope was, at least at the beginning of this period of censorship, was that the censors would be able to go through the books in arrears during the close of the trading season. Because remember that the port in Riga freezes over in the winter, and so much fewer books are supposed to be imported. And yet, the books just keep coming. There's no let up, really, in the number of books. And this is not just a sort of bureaucratic administrative problem, because nobody in Riga can sell books unless those books have been cleared by censorship first. And that means several prominent book merchants went bankrupt over this period simply because there were books piled up in the censorship office, unread and unapproved. And one of the most important book publishers based in 18th century Riga, who had very close ties with the Academy of Sciences throughout the 1780s, was a really major player in the process of Russian Enlightenment, essentially went bankrupt and had to relocate to Leipzig because it was no longer possible to do business in 18th century Russia as a book importer of any kind. Because the state was unwilling to allow books to go through without being inspected. And although that major player, I forget the name off the top of my head, but they even got a special exemption that allowed them to do their own book inspections. But somehow the process was so convoluted that they were unable to process the books in time. So these bureaucratic delays had a real material impact on the book culture of late 19th century Russia, to such a point where the sort of commercial activities that this enabled were seriously under threat. Because, of course, printing was not a philanthropic enterprise. For the most part, it was something that people did for money. So what is causing this accumulation of arrears? I can only speculate here because there's not really a concrete solution to this question. But we can compare the 1798 Vedomast to October 1799. I don't have the November one here because it has some discrepancies that are going to be confusing. So I decided to use the October one instead. So here it says that by October 1798, there were 6,445 books in arrears. 5,000 more arrived, right? And that they were able to process 4,317, which means obviously that some 4,000, some 3,000 remain. Basically what that means is not that the censors are processing less, right? Because they processed 1,000 more books than in 1798, but simply that many more were arriving. So 2,000 more books arrived in the fall of 1799 than in 1798. I don't know what this has to do with. I think maybe it has to do with the end of the War of the First Coalition, or maybe it was simply a better trading year for some other reason. We can maybe talk about that later. But the key point here is that they are working as hard as they can, it seems like. Because if you think about it, 3 people doing 4,000 books in a month, or even let's say if they were doing 2,500 books in a month, right? That is something like 25 books a day, right? And I can barely grade 25 papers in a day. I don't know how you can process 25 books in a day that actually, in a way that actually determines whether they have subversive political content or not, right? Because remember that they're not just sort of like scanning through it, ideally. They are trying to figure out if what the message of the book is destructive to the political order in Russia, or some other, or the cultural policies of the state, or whatever, right? So anyway, this is a lot of work for 3 people, and it seems to not be enough ever, but especially in 1799. So by the time we get to the end of 1799, there's over 7,000 books in arrears. That is not a great sign. And as it turns out, there's also a major conflict between the censors and the local authorities. And this is sort of like the closing. I mean, I'm getting to the end here. But this is from a a series of document exchanges between Tumanskii and Ludwig von Nagel, who is the civil governor of Riga. More on this later. So Tumanskii says a lot of stuff justifying why censorship is not being done. He says that there are 100 times more readers in Riga and its surrounding gubernias and the whole rest of the vast Russian Empire. This is probably an exaggeration, but it's not a significant exaggeration. And Tumanskii says that book enlightenment has been turned by so-called speculators into a branch of destructive commerce. In other words, he is not saying that the Jacobins are conspiring to undermine the Russian state. He says that simply the book consumption habits of the Riga public are such that they rule out what he says, kniga prosvещения, book enlightenment. They rule out the sort of positive effects of that. And he's completely overcome. He says, I never could have imagined they would so greedily and senselessly grab everything. So these readers, according to Tumanskii, notably that his task as a censor does not conflict in his mind with his role as a participant in the process of Catherinian enlightenment. In fact, it is continuous with it because his role as an enlightener is precisely to make sure that readers read the good stuff and not the bad stuff. But as censor, he quickly finds that Riga readers who are embraced by the destructive tide of commercial capitalism are incapable of being properly policed. So that is one explanation for the failure of censorship, is simply that there are too many readers. But Nagel, who is Tumanskii's opponent, who is a very senior Baltic aristocrat, right? Ludwig von Nagel, notably, he's the civil governor. So Tumanskii is under direct imperial control and not under his direct control. So they have to fight each other in appealing to Paul rather than Nagel being able to order around Tumanskii directly. So at some point, the conflict. So Nagel actually believes that Tumanskii is not working hard enough, and they send sort of like cross petitions, basically alleging that the other is not doing his job properly. And at one point, Nagel decides to do an in-person inspection of Tumanskii's activities. So he says that at 10 in the morning, he found that, Tumanskii's just sitting around reading newspapers. Presumably he's checking them over for bad material, but, maybe he's just having his morning coffee. And on the table, there's some collected works from the library of the late King of France. And the reason that library is there is that Louis XVIII, the King of France's brother, is currently taking asylum in Mitau. So presumably his library is being investigated by the censors. So Nagel is, of course, stunned that there are no other censors working. There's all these books in arrears and nobody seems to be doing their job. But Tumanskii says, well, you can't really read books in the office because there's too many people there. And, you can't think when there's too many people around. I think because it's an open plan office, that was not part of the management culture of late 18th century Riga. So clearly he hadn't thought about it. And also, I think maybe people at this time read aloud rather than silently. So perhaps that would have been also a big problem. However, Tumanskii is unable to present a daily register of his activities, so he can't actually prove that the other censors are doing their jobs at home. And Nagel says that the censors come to the office, and while waiting for an appointment with someone like the agent of a bookseller, they sit around uselessly and lose time they could be using to read books. So in this rendering, Tumanskii is not overwhelmed by a tide of bad books. And in fact, Nagel points out, well, policing the readership of books is precisely why the censorship exists. Like, this is your job, literally. And also, like, there's all these bad plays being put on, to which Tumanskii says, I don't have time to go to plays. I have too many books to read. So, they're fighting each other. And notably, this Vedomist back here is only signed, actually, is signed by the other two censors. Yeah, Tuchemir is actually the Protieri. He's the religious censor, and Christian Zon is, I think, maybe the military censor. There's like three types of censors. I don't remember what the third one is off the top of my head. Anyway, so notably Tumanskii does not sign off on this one, although normally on the others he does. So it's possible that one of the reasons for this rise in arrears is that Tumanskii has been so alienated, or something has happened that he's no longer doing his job. But it seems unlikely. It seems basically that there's this bureaucratic conflict. And here's what happens in the end. Basically, so I want to kind of, by showing what happens at the end, I want to ask whether this is in fact a local problem or an imperial one. What happens in the end, according to Kotzebue, is that Tumanskii writes in a denunciation of everyone who is in a position of official authority in Riga, starting with Nagel, and as basically Jacobin conspirators. And he sends this denunciation directly to Alexander. And Alexander says this is the work of a crazy person and dismisses, forces Tumanskii into retirement. Tumanskii is then left penniless and is forced to turn to the public charity of Riga to collect money for him, which the charity does, which Kotzebue cites as an example of the civic-mindedness of the Riga population. So this question of whether this is a local problem or an imperial one, I think is really important. Is the failure of the Riga censorship just, these two people? And I think it's kind of a false dilemma in that imperial problems are also local ones in this particular case, right? That this is not just a problem of the Riga censorship, it's also a problem of the fact that the empire is a space of uneven development in which different information regimes and different kinds of graphospheres subsist at different parts of it. And so because Paul's policy is unable to properly account for the uniquely weighty task that the Riga censorship faces, I think he's unable to solve the dilemma of generating enough state capacity to effectively repress a graphosphere that is very, very different in Riga than it is even in Moscow or St. Petersburg. So that's my kind of analytical takeaway from this question, which is that in order to understand the problem of censorship and why the importation of books had to be banned entirely, you have to understand both the local context of Riga and the imperial context of the Pauline reign. Now, in the last minute, I will just talk about the future of Russian censorship after this edict. Of course, Paul gets assassinated less than a year after this edict passes. Alexander comes to the throne. He's this big liberal, right? He says he restores, he kind of like bans the Pauline censorship institutions and institutes the Danish censorship code, which relaxes and says, which basically relaxes censorship and says that, ambiguities in a text should be given the benefit of the doubt in relation to the author. So in theory, it's a relaxation of censorship, but in fact, what it results in is the professionalization of censorship and its extension into multiple different sets of institutions, including at post offices, universities, and so forth. That lead to vastly greater amounts of censors being appointed, and thus with far greater capacity to process texts, and thus a much more effective ambition in terms of being able to effectively police the entire empire. And that is the censorship structure that Nicholas I ultimately inherits and turns into a much more rigid code with which all 19th century literary historians, I'm sure, are familiar. Thank you so much.
Let's go to Linda Mayhew, our subsidnik.
Thank you. And thank you, Greg, for this really interesting talk. There's so many things that you've brought up that I appreciate about your research that I'd like to comment on. I'm sure I won't get to all of them. But I think your work, it really highlights everything that is unique about Riga's censorship during the censorship office during Paul's reign, its position as a borderland, the volume of texts, the high level of literacy in the region, and it situates these unique qualities within the context of themes that are running throughout the 19th century in Russian culture, like the give and take between Russia and Western Europe, and the tension between administration and the creative process. And while censorship is often considered in terms of writing, the idea of the graphosphere underscores the point that these restrictions encompassed a range of public texts like theatrical performances or sheet music. I really like the playing card example. And so I'm especially interested to see these themes through the lens of Paul's rule and Riga's censorship office, as so much scholarship on censorship starts later, 1825 or 1830, and is often situated in Moscow or St. Petersburg. And so seeing these themes play out in an earlier time in a city that is a cultural crossroads expands our perspective. So continuing with some of these broader themes that come up, Riga as a cultural and geographic borderland with this immense influx of texts and a wide array of languages highlight Russia's conflicted relationship with Western European ideas, whereas Catherine welcomes Western Enlightenment ideas in literature, Paul forbids them. And sort of this blanket rejection of Western European literature speaks to fears of revolution, but also is mimicking the more severe censorship policies that are in Western Europe just a little bit around the time of the revolution. And then later we have Alexander I looking to Danish policies. So considering Riga and this cultural crossroads really highlights this confluence of influences on censorship. Tumanskii calls to mind the experience of some other censors that are later in the 19th century, some of whom are invested in literature as either editors, writers, scholars, and are navigating between upholding policy and supporting art. We have the poet Tuchev, university professor Nikitenko, novelist Ivan Goncharov, and those all come to mind as censors who have their own agendas and their own ideas, but find themselves in similar situations of negotiating the space between enforcing policy and permitting aesthetic growth. And then with Tumanskii, there seems to be this additional contradiction that some of his censorship decisions seem to be too strict, while some are too liberal. So that's just really interesting. But I love this story of him sitting in the office by himself, where Nagel comes in and Tumanskii's maybe reading for work or maybe not. There's a couple books piled around him. And this image reminds us that censorship literally is a messy bureaucratic process. And these challenges that you've talked about, finding censors who are qualified for the work with that level of education, literacy in multiple languages, and sort of managing this quantity of texts that we see under Paul and in Riga are ongoing issues continuing throughout the 19th century. The temporary censorship rules in 1865, which is jumping way ahead, but those were under Alexander II, and those were intended in part to address this overwhelming amount of material to censor that they were still trying to figure out. And so your research shows that these problems, in fact, arose much earlier than that and had been existing for a while. So I'm going to stop there with my comments. I'm sure other people have questions and comments they'd like to make. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
I want to just say one thing about what you brought up in terms of the materiality of censorship at the end of your comments there. One thing that I didn't really note is that the substance of the argument between Nagel and Tumanskii is that basically Tumanskii wants a bigger space for the censorship office, which Nagel interprets as him wanting a free house at the expense of the state, and says that, well, Tumanskii has this censorship already, in the it's in the Riga castle, which has like 3 rooms there. And Tumanskii's like, well, that's not enough space for even the books we have to read, much less, our actual work. And then so Nagel's inspection is in part designed to prove that he's not using the space efficiently, and therefore doesn't deserve a separate house, right? So this is the housing problem is like behind a lot of this, and this is a perennial problem apparently in 18th century Riga, especially at the end of this period. So there is actually a very direct material quandary about where do you fit 4,000 books for people to be able to read them. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. Well, people are collecting their thoughts and questions, and you can either raise your virtual hand or you can put a question in the chat. Can I just ask Greg one quick question? What happened to a censor who passed something that was then deemed bad?
So what I've read is that basically it's only Alexander's adoption of the Danish censorship code that imposes personal responsibility on censors for bad stuff going through. So in the past, I think there's not a direct responsibility on them. The responsibility is still on the person who published or imported the book, I guess, or sold the book. And so it's a little bit laxer at this time, and there's not as much personal accountability. Whereas later in the 19th century, they are going to be personally liable.
Thank you. I see Joseph Bradley has a hand up.
Thanks, Greg. This is really fascinating material, and I can see a kind of perennial Russian problems in this, continuing in the 19th century and even in the 20th century. So I just have 2 very short comments. The one text that referred to speculators reminded me so much of kind of the late Soviet period, when so-called banned or semi-banned books had high black market value. And the value was clearly not just in the content of the book, but the fact that it kind of was a thing. And, it could be used as a commodity, almost instead of rubles, along with blue jeans. The other comment, I guess, refers to your epilogue and maybe a word of caution from a 19th century historian, in that problems of the censorship seem to continue despite the fact that they may have become more professional or better organized, but there still was a censorship overload. And the most famous example that everybody cites is that Marx's Capital got through the censorship, but overload and sort of inconsistency seem to persist. You don't know sometimes why something is censored and why something is not censored. And perhaps it's because of the overload. Things get through, not because people don't know what they're about, but there just wasn't enough time at the office today. I don't know. But anyway, those are my comments. I think I appreciated your talk.
Thank you so much, Brad. Yeah, I think the line about the Soviets, I think, is interesting because it's I mean, in this case, you do have, an attempt to control private trade, and basically this attempt to ban private trade as a solution to the inability to control it. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that you see repeatedly in the 19th and 20th centuries as well. And I think you're right that basically it's the ambition of censorship and its capacity are continually at such a high level that lots of things do slip through. And of course, the perennial Russian proverb is that the harshness of the laws is mitigated by their uneven applicability or something, or their uneven execution. And I think this is a classic case of that. But what we rarely see, I think, is the direct connection between, the literal numerical connection between the tasks of the censorship and their actual ability to execute on them. So yeah, I thought that was just an interesting tidbit in the archive.
Thank you. I see Chris Rain has her hand up, and then Yasin Abdullayev.
Thanks, Greg. Again, this was great and eye-opening for sure. But as I understand it, you're working on Poly in Russia in the whole sort of kit and caboodle. So how would this talk change our understanding of Paul's reign? Or does it? Or does it confirm what we think we know? Or does it transform it in some way? And what would that be?
Yeah, so my current project is not exactly on Paul's Russia. It's sort of like, essentially, the first part of the project deals with the pre-1801 period, but in terms of Paul's relationship to other conservative elites post-French Revolution. So this fits into a broader picture of trying to understand the specifics of Russia's response to the French Revolution, but also how that response connected to other projects. Really, this is sort of one of those side things. Like I found this data in the Latvian archive, and I was so fascinated by it that I decided to write something about it. It wasn't a direct part of the book, but I do think it sheds light on some certain things. One of the things that really struck me about the Tumanskii quote in particular is that he says, people in other well-ordered states that care about the well-being of humanity also, will confirm that the book market is turning into this evil place where people are buying bad novels. I think this is this is a understanding of censorship as not something that's specifically Russian, but something that is specifically done by states that are resisting the revolution. And I think that's generally true. Of course, you have similar policies in Britain and elsewhere over the course of the late 18th century that very much fall in line with this. I think the other thing that's interesting for me is the Courland aspect, because Courland is really the one place where French revolutionary politics touches down more or less directly in Russia, as opposed to the writings of intellectuals. And I think its connection to the Riga market is a sort of indirect indication of the dangers of the revolutionary context for Russia. But yeah, thanks for the question. It's this is more of a side angle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Yasin Abdullayev, and then two questions in the chat that I'll read out after Yasin.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. Very, very interesting. And I had just a series of few technical questions very briefly. First, you mentioned that number, which is an extraordinary number, like it's 25 books a day, which is even even for a graduate student who goes through qualifying exams, is very impressive, right? It's just, the question is how. So I wonder, do you know anything maybe about the techniques of reading? Did they ever mention it, how they would go through that book? Is it just the introduction, or, I mean, because it seems impossible to read the whole thing, right, if it's 25 things a day. My other question is something about the incentives from the state, from the government. I mean, compared maybe to other state institutions, right? Because again, it seems that they're doing this overwhelming work. Do you know anything about how they were salaried? Were they kind of have better salaries than maybe, you know, other comparable institutions, or had anything on top of that to incentivize them to actually work efficiently, right? Because you mentioned that they had problems even with housing. They even didn't know where to stockpile all those books. So one actually just, you know, has a question about how was this work in fact more or less efficient, even, you know, at its minimum capacity? Because in such circumstance, I mean, how can you work in such conditions, right, basically? And then the third question would be about the collaboration between Riga censorship and maybe censorship branches or offices from the other countries. Because I know that for the context of the 1830s, right, Russia would collaborate with Austria and Prussia a lot to kind of censor and sort through all this type of literature, right? And maybe sometimes censors would exchange with each other with the information or their own conclusions that they're made. So, because Riga is, you know, so much in the West and kind of has this nearby borders, were there any examples of collaboration, which I think, right, also might be a case because it was kind of a collaborative effort to hold down the revolution from the monarchical states in Europe? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. These are really good questions. Unfortunately, my answers to them are very limited because the information I have and is pretty much what I have, and the details, this is as much detail as I've been able to find. In terms of the process of reading, my guess is that the number of books refers to the number of copies total, not distinct titles. And so I think what they're probably doing is they're investigating the first of, you know, let's say you have a run, a box of 500 copies of the same book. My guess is they're probably reading that book and then flipping through the rest of the copies to see that to make sure that it's the same book, even with the same title page and everything. That would still probably require a lot of work because, you know, you're trying to make sure that you know, one page in the middle hasn't been replaced or something. But my guess is that they're not physically reading 2,000 books or whatever. The remuneration question, I mean, part of it is that they were appointed, that censors were appointed by the state. And so, you know, it's not like a job that you really apply for as far as I can tell. And so, you know, there's an aspect of like state service to this. It does seem to be pretty well remunerated, but somebody with that level of education and that level of social standing could probably find a comparable job elsewhere. This job, I mean, if Nagel is correct, then, you know, Tumanskii is probably able to get away with a pretty great deal of autonomy in his work, despite the huge amount of effort that he has to put into it. But, and of course, you know, the language of like, we don't have enough space, like we need this and that is like the typical 18th century petition language where you have to, you know, exaggerate your material difficulties in the hopes of getting some sort of payout from the state. That's what everyone does. So I'm careful not to read that too literally, generally speaking. In terms of collaboration, there is a lot of police collaboration. So authorities in Germany will send names of people who are suspicious or who are maybe carrying suspicious books or correspondence or documents. So that kind of thing is noticeable in that archive. But I've not noticed anything in relation to censors interacting with each other. My guess is simply because there's just not enough time. Like that would just be far too time consuming for the kinds of tasks that they have to face. They're not really, and actually, like, I think primarily what I've seen is that this stage of the censorship is they're picking out potentially suspicious titles that they can then hand on to the state council, which then reads them and issues a decision. So perhaps it's the state council that will then be aware of foreign attempts to do this, but this is the sort of initial filtering stage, is my sense. Yeah, but thank you for all these questions. They're very good.
Thank you, Greg. I'm going to read out one of the questions from the chats from Margaret Shamu. And then after that, I'm going to hand the mic to Ilya Kliger because I have to run to another meeting, and Ilya will read out Eugene Clay's question. So Margaret says, Greg, thank you for a fascinating talk. You mentioned early on that sheet music posed a special case. Would you please elaborate on that? As an art historian, I'm interested because sheet music was often published with an image printed on the cover. What role did the presence of images in sheet music or with other texts play in censorship during this period?
Thank you for a fascinating question. Again, this is one of those things where I have to speculate, hopefully in an informed way rather than in a completely random way. But my direct evidence is very slim. But first of all, I mean, I think the main danger with sheet music is basically the fact that it would contain songs, because songs are a uniquely disseminable text, right? And so if somebody reads a song from some sheet music and sings it to somebody else, that person can learn that song easily, even if they're not literate. And I think that's probably what the state is concerned by. I mean, as I haven't seen any evidence of like Saiha or whatever being distributed in 18th century Riga, but presumably that's at least something that the state is aware of, the possibility of happening. And then probably I'm assuming the librettos would also, of any sort of like opera type text would presumably also be a source of danger. I think images, that's a really interesting question. So far, none of the sources that I've run into have mentioned the sort of image aspect, but that does make sense. I mean, it would be something that would be encountered. And given that many musicians are foreign or actually are serfs, both of those things are potentially dangerous or subversive. So I wonder if the particular sort of intersection of music with potentially dangerous types of people is an area of concern for that.
Thank you, Greg. I'm gonna read out a question from Eugene Clay. I'm curious about Kotzebue as a source for Tumanskii. Kotzebue was exiled to Siberia for a year during Paul's reign and wrote plays that could be considered critical of serfdom. Could you say something about how Kotzebue's position as a writer and political thinker affects his view of a censor like Tumanskii? Thanks for the wonderful talk.
Yeah, thanks, Eugene. So this is something I've thought a lot about, because actually the initial context for me thinking about writing this up as a document is my friend Anna Nanyeva, who has this sort of like blog and project on Kotzebue from many different directions in Germany. And so I was thinking about how to portray this, but one of the things we were talking about, she and I were talking about, was that Kotzebue is politically extremely ambiguous, right? So on the one hand, he does have this experience of exile, and potentially subversive ideas, but on the other hand, he's an intelligence agent for the Russian government in Germany and is assassinated precisely for that reason. And he has a sort of informal representative of Alexander, at the court, I think in Hamburg or wherever he was. Anyway, so Kotzebue has this very ambiguous political position, and I think in this text, which comes from his memoir of this year, 1799, which is where he experiences all these problems, I don't think that certainly they're not sympathetic to the French Revolution. I think this is this is the bad old days of Paul, and now we have the good days of Alexander type of idea. I think the idea is to highlight the more absurd and excessive nature of Tumanskii's activities as a censor in partially to legitimize more normal types of activities. Although I think I need to reread the whole book to really get that, because I was really more focused on the Tumanskii specific content. But there is a lot of stuff that's complementary of the Russian authorities in there. So it's not straightforwardly a subversive text, even though it's published. I don't think it's published in Russia originally. I think it's published in Germany somewhere. But thanks for the great question.
Thank you. And I will read out Margaret Shamu's comment. With song, it's also possible that the melody may carry connotations that aren't obvious in the text.
Yeah, I wonder if it's like resembles Saira, for example, as a melody. Like I wonder if that would suggest something. And I wonder how these melodies spread. I mean, we have Darton's work on how it spread within Paris, but I wonder how far it goes east. That would be. I really wish I could have something more in the revolutionary soundscape of Central and Eastern Europe to draw in there.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? I have just a very quick question, and a very ignorant one. I'm curious, what is in the comparative context, would it be possible to say something about the way in which this sort of thing works? For example, in Prussia at this time, is there a sense of a more efficient process there than in the Russian Empire at the same time, or not?
So yeah, this is legwork that I have not done yet, but I need to do it. The problem is, so I think other states were able to dynamically adapt to the consequences of a sort of like expansion of printing and literacy over the course of the 18th century. And so, for example, French censorship, by the time you get to the 18th century, is incredibly well developed. I think in Russia, because of the fact that, you know, Enlightenment was confined to certain groups of educated elites, and Riga was not until the 1790s perceived as a particularly dangerous area for that, as far as I can tell. So they didn't conceptualize the expanding graphosphere as inherently threatening. So they didn't have the same adaptation process, and Russian censorship remained relatively underdeveloped in comparison to other European countries because there was less to police. I think Catherine probably personally knew every single person who had written a book in 18th century Russia. At least judging by Novikov's Dictionary of Russian Writers, it really wasn't that many people. So I think that's a big difference, is that basically I don't know what exactly their censorship apparatus looked like, but my guess is that it was larger simply because it had had more time to evolve. And also because I think banning the import of foreign books in a place like Prussia is not really viable, just because it's connected by land to so many different smuggling routes. Whereas, you know, Riga is the outpost of an empire that's otherwise relatively well protected, at least on its western borderlands.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Eugene, I'll type in her name, Anna Ananyeva. She's the author of a book called Russische Grün about the culture of Russian gardens in the 18th century. And as well as many other books. She's also working on Krusenstern, who is related to Kotzebue.
Oh, that's very helpful. Thank you. Anyone else?
I
Yeah.
have one more
Linda,
question.
please.
I was interested in, you mentioned some texts in Hebrew from the Pale Settlement, and I was wondering if you'd come across anything about maybe how those texts in particular might have been treated differently than texts from Western Europe, or how any religious versus secular texts might have any differences in how those were treated.
Yeah, so the religious texts had their own censor, the Proteire Techamira, or whoever his name was. And I think, generally speaking, well, yeah, there are quite a few religious disputes, and Hiking, who is one of our main sources for the Baltic states in the late 18th century, Baron von Hiking, talks a bit about those. But unfortunately, my German is not really, I mean, it's good enough to sometimes read a title, but the 18th century script is so hard to read that I just skip over it most of the time. So I didn't really pay attention to what was banned in the religious realm and what was not. But that is something I should probably return to. And, you know, of course, a lot of these 18th century books have completely indistinguishable titles that, you know, might convey this is a proto-atheistic text, or this is a Protestant text, or an Orthodox text. It's hard to tell. But I should look into that. The Hebrew stuff, my sense is that basically, well, because the Jewish population was such a new thing for the Russian Empire, they basically were like, well, we can't leave this massive volume of print completely unpoliced, so we need some Jews to police them. But I mean, obviously 18th century academics do learn Hebrew, but I think that they had, you know, that they had these Jews running their separate expedition, but I couldn't have any evidence that any of their texts were actually seen as collecting like any kind of political content. I think for the most part, they are scriptures, religious texts. They're like Sephiroth or whatever. Like that says, like, you know, there's like some kind of Talmudic texts in that list. So yeah, so my sense is that this is kind of an afterthought. But yeah, presumably it gains more relevance later as the Jewish question becomes more acute in the empire.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think that's, well, if that's it, I'm just very happy that I've had such amazing questions in this audience. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg and Linda. Thank you so much for the discussion and the paper and we will see you next time.
Yeah, thank you so much.